Hello, my name is Constance Haydock. I'm a landscape architect and landscape historian, and I'm going to speak about the gardens of Paris. Like so many of you, I had traveled to Paris and visited the beautiful gardens, but I had no idea how important they were to the Parisians themselves. There are more than 400 parks and gardens, large areas such as the Bois de Boulogne, the Bois de Vincennes, small squares in the arrondissement, and then tiny pocket parks that spread throughout Paris. The activities in the Parisian gardens run the gamut. Parisians use their gardens for activities such as reading, gossiping, more reading, playing chess, painting, playing, and gossiping. And in fact, the filmmakers are throughout the Parisian gardens that I visited. I'm going to speak a little bit about the very large parks, the Bois de Vincennes, the Bois de Boulogne, that are on either side of the city of Paris. Medium-sized parks such as the Butte Chaumont, Luxembourg Garden, the Parc Monceau, and even the small gardens, such as the potted plants that were grouped together in the little tiny courtyard at the base of my apartment, and the squares that are used as the local parks in the arrondissement. To give a little historical background, I'm going to talk about what created some of these gardens. But before we do, I want to talk about some of the important themes and elements. Maintenance plays a great deal of importance in Parisian gardens. Topiary is a highly refined art, and I even came across a template that was used at Versailles to create the perfect balls of the topiary. Other themes that we'll look at are the abundance of roses throughout the gardens, the very well manicured hedges, and the bedding out of the annuals. Indeed, even in the middle of the Tuileries garden, which is the very formal monarch's garden in the middle of Paris, I found an area where plant material could be staged to be replaced when maintenance required new plants in areas that had been worn out or plants had died. Another thing we'll look at are the ubiquitous bosques of trees, predominantly linden, but also sycamore. The practice of pollarding, which is the very severe pruning of the branches. And here we see some of the pleached sycamores at one of the medium-sized gardens, the Jardin des Plantes. Some of the elements of gardens include the famous Versailles caisses, which are the very large planters used to transport tender trees into greenhouses in the winter. Even smaller planters with boxwood. Elements such as sculpture are everywhere in the Parisian gardens. And fountains. The historical precedent of the formal French garden began really in the medieval times. This is a good example of a cloister garden, which is actually located in New York City. It was brought to New York by the Rockefellers, and it exemplifies the type of garden that was seen inside of a cloister. This is called a cloister garth. The center vessel was used for irrigation and some cleaning, but also it was an area that could be looked upon by those walking in the covered peristyle area that comprised the cloister. The first pleasure gardens were brought to Paris when Francois I, King of France, in 1494 invaded Italy. And there, a pleasure garden was beginning to become popular with the different areas, particularly around Florence. The Chateau d'Amboise, well, there's not a lot left of what was created and brought back by the king. We can see the pollarded sycamores, but at the time that it was built, it had gravel paths, steps, fountains, and of course shaded areas for the kings and queens to hold courtly rituals or whatnot. About 25 years later, the King Charles VII's finance minister, Jean Le Breton, was also the ambassador to Italy. And he was so intrigued with Italian garden design that he actually took courses and was tutored in the style of Italian garden design. He brought back to Charles VII's Chateau Chambord, in the lower right of the screen, many of the techniques that he learned in Italy. He also had his own chateau, Villandry, in the upper left-hand corner. And this chateau is a wonderful example today of what it looked like in the 16th century. But let's go to Paris itself and understand some of the historical trends that have created the gardens that we see today. Catherine de' Medici was as her name implies, was a Medici woman who had grown up in Florence at the Boboli Gardens. So she was imbued with a sense of Italian garden design. She was married to Henri II. And when she moved to the Tuileries Palace, which was connected or part of the Louvre, she brought the Italian style of gardening. In the left-hand side, we see the garden as it was laid out by her and the gardeners she brought from Italy. There are 6 or 7 pathways with geometric gardens. The Tuileries Palace is the top of that left-hand slide. And then about 100 years later, the most famous landscape designer of all, André Le Nôtre, created a more modern, at the time, garden and really exemplified the French style of gardening, the so-called Jardin des Français. This differed from the Italian style of gardening in that the central axis was broad, very impressive. You see at the bottom of the slide, and this is a present-day view of the Tuileries Garden. You see the Louvre at the top of the slide. Today, the Tuileries Palace no longer exists. It was burned down. But the garden itself is magnificent in the design of André Le Nôtre. He had the most important effect on the garden as we see it today. This is a view of a lawn with annuals, perennials, and of course the statue and the pleached trees with the area created beneath them that's almost like an outdoor room. If you look at this bird's eye view, you'll note a long swath of gravel in the lower left-hand part of the garden. When I was looking at the gardens of Paris, I spent a week looking at 25 gardens. I noticed that soccer players had taken some of the chairs from the Tuileries Garden and placed them in this gravel area, which they used as the goals for their soccer game. So amongst the great statues, the trees that are protected, they were having a soccer game. Now this view also reminds me of something I saw 6 months ago, and if you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, you will see great construction going on along Fifth Avenue. And that, in about a year, we will see what you see in this image, which is a view of the proposed redoing of the front of the Metropolitan Museum. You see the pollarded trees on the lower right and the great, the small areas, but wonderful areas of shade for people to collect. And of course, there'll be fountains. This is just this reminds me so much of the Tuileries Gardens, the French style of gardening. And here we are in the 21st century, and we're still learning from what was done. Versailles, of course, is the most impressive of all of the great French gardens. This is outside of Paris. I could spend an hour on Versailles, but I'll just mention it briefly. The whole idea of Versailles was the king, Louis XIV, hired André Le Nôtre, the French landscape designer who first worked at the Tuileries, hired André Le Nôtre to create a garden that showed Louis XIV's dominance over man. So this garden is really a symbol of the king and his ability to control nature, to control the world around him. You can see a long, very wide central axis of the garden. We've developed from the Italian style of gardening in that it's not a small, intimate space, but it's very open, and again meant to show that Louis XIV and then his successors, 15th and 16th, are the dominant men in the country. One of the gardens, which is really more or less an urban space that is of particular interest to designers and landscape architects, is Place des Vosges. It was created in the early 1600s by Henry IV. He built 32, with his architects, he built 32 townhouses, as well as 2 palaces for himself and his queen. What I found very interesting at Place des Vosges was a small secret door, which I found in the southwestern corner of Place des Vosges. It leads to another garden, which is part of a palace, former palace in Paris, a townhouse, very large, Hôtel de Sully. And Monsieur de Sully, the Duc de Sully, was the treasurer for Louis XIV. So clearly he had his hands on quite a lot of income and could produce a garden for himself as well as a palace. This area is used actually as a pass-through for people going from a nearby boulevard to the Place des Vosges. I found it an intimate green space. You can see the little boy riding his bike when I was there. He kept riding round and round. But there's also a wonderful element on the right side, and that is a very simple green wall. The green wall consists of numerous different type of plants in different hues of green. We've got a blue-green, a yellow-green, and the entire wall is covered with ivy. And there is a simple Gothic fragment, probably from a church, that is placed as a piece of sculpture in the garden. Our next garden, Luxembourg Garden, is considered a medium-sized garden, but of great importance to Parisians. This was created by another Medici, Maria de' Medici, who moved from the Boboli Gardens, where she'd grown up, as had Catherine de' Medici. She was living at another palace, the Tuileries Palace, but her husband died, who was King Henry IV, who was also the creator of Place des Vosges. So she built her own palace, Luxembourg Palace. The upper left is a overhead view of the main garden. You can see a very stylized, symmetrical area in the center, and then to the left are more naturalized areas. This was the gardens that were added later, about 100 years later. One of the great elements of Luxembourg Gardens is the Medici fountain, the duck where ducks land. One can hang over the railing, look at the water, hear the water. It was designed by an Italian landscape designer that Maria de' Medici invited and asked to build the fountain. And this is a shot of the more English style, the less formal areas that was added after the original garden was built. One of the elements that you see everywhere in Luxembourg Gardens is the Caisse de Versailles, the planters, the very large planters that are copied, and I've seen them throughout the United States. It's a design that has lasted today. And this is Luxembourg Palace. Napoleon in 1801 decided that this would become the home of the Senate. He also declared that Luxembourg Gardens would be a garden for children and created areas for children to sail their sailboats, to play ball games, and to generally enjoy the gardens. In this particular view, I was fascinated with the bedding out of the annuals. Remember, this is the Senate building, a very important building to the Parisians. And in front, I saw very simple annuals, such as salvia and geraniums, coleus, and petunias. A great deal of maintenance, mind you, but again, this is the Senate building, so it is important to make a show for not only Parisians, but also tourists. The next garden I'm going to talk about is the Jardin des Plantes. This was originally the medicinal garden created for Louis XIII on the Ile de la Cité, the small island in the middle of Paris. The Jardin des Plantes was specifically created to grow medicinal plants for the king. The doctors who took care of the king wanted a larger space, and they asked him if they could move the garden to its present location. Today, it is still an important garden for research. The building, you see, is where a tremendous amount of botanical research takes place. And in addition, there are gardens with varieties of, in this case, they're geraniums, many different geraniums, specific gardens, theme gardens, and areas where Parisians as well as tourists can visit and look at certain plants that they want to research or have a deeper knowledge of. But it's also a pleasure garden. Now, we're going to shift because in the early 1800s, a brand new style of garden design came to France. It first began in England, and a good example of the English landscape style or the picturesque style of English gardening took place at Stourhead. You may think that this is a totally natural site, but like our own Central Park, Stourhead is totally man-made. The bridge, the lake, the temple beyond. The English landscape style was a reaction to the formal gardens, the Jardin de la Française, that had been the predominant landscape style throughout 200 years in France. And in the 1800s, under the design of Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton, the English landscape style became the style of gardening not only in England, but gradually in France. First garden we'll look at that is a good example of the English landscape style is Désert des Rets. Désert des Rets is not located within Paris. It's about 20 kilometers from Versailles, just outside the city. It is a wonderful assemblage of what are called garden follies, or different representations of time. For instance, this pyramid is a miniature version of an Egyptian pyramid. Désert des Rets has about 20 more such edifices that represent different time and different ages, but all in miniature. This is a Tartar tent, which was used during wars, or it's symbolic of what was used during wars, and this was placed on a small island at Désert des Rets. This is the only folly, garden folly at Désert des Rets that is not original. This was a replication of what was built in the 1880s when this garden was created. The creator was Monsieur de Monville, a so-called gentleman of fashion. He was the designer of this garden. He brought in help, of course, but he was the main architectural and artistic influence. This is an example of his Temple of Pan, and on the back side, it's totally deteriorated, and this is how it was built. The front was meant to look original, as if it had been taken from ancient Rome or Greece, and the back side, it was falling down. This is a good example of a Gothic folly. You can barely make out in the window the outline of the Gothic design, covered with vines. And again, this is how this particular edifice was built, to look like a ruin. The most interesting and widely known element of Des Retz is the so-called column temple. And unlike the other follies that we just looked at, this is meant to be only a portion of a giant column. So if you can imagine a temple that would have such a column, the temple would reach into the sky. This is just a broken part of the lower part of the temple, but it's been blown up to create, in this case, it was actually lived in by Monsieur de Montville. It had 5 stories, 1 underground. One of the visitors to Des Retz was Thomas Jefferson. He used the floor plan of the broken column at Des Retz for his design for the University of Virginia Rotunda. And today it exists. We can see it now. He also participated in a competition for the Washington Capitol. His admission was not accepted, but the design for his submission for the Capitol was based on what he had seen when he was in Paris and visited this very peculiar folly. Another English landscape-style garden, which exists very much in excellent condition today, is Parc Monceau, which is near the Tuileries. It was originally built by a cousin of the king. It was a private park, but became open to the public in 1860. It has also a great deal of elements. The English follies, this is a good example of a beautifully sequestered classical bridge. There were other elements, including a Japanese pond area. This is a classical rotunda that was used as a customs house. The Duke, the cousin of the king, would require that those passing by on his road, that he would take payment from them to enter the city of Paris. And then we have the beautiful spread of columns that are connected by a cornice behind a weeping willow in front of a duck pond. And this is a great example of an ancient Roman creation. And if you look, the upper right-hand side, this is what we can see today at the Villa Hadrian outside of Rome. The Villa Hadrian was built in the 1st century AD for a Roman general. And this idea of an ancient broken edifice was borrowed by the French designer for Parc Monceau in his park. The next English landscape garden that we'll look at is Bagatelle. This is actually a park within a larger park, the Bois de Boulogne. Bagatelle was a result of a wager between the brother of the king and Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI's wife. And the brother very, very boastfully said, "I can build a garden and a house in 3 months." Marie Antoinette said, I'll take your wager. And Bagatelle was a result. It actually was built in under 3 months. And while this building that you see, this is a very small chateau, is quite formal, the rest of the garden was an English landscape garden with multiple follies. Today, it has a famous rose garden, which has a competition every summer in roses. The orangerie, or the greenhouse, is the building you see behind the very carefully pruned yews. And this is another typical element of the English landscape gardens, a rose arbor on top of a pergola to create shade on the hot summer days. This is part of the vegetable garden. Throughout Paris, the gardens are, almost all of them have a potager or a vegetable garden. A wonderful definition I heard of a potager is it has the very English idea of a productive garden, and yet it has the elegance of French couture. And that's what a potager represents, and shows not only great production in its material and its production of fruits and vegetables, but also is laid out in a stylish manner. The roses, and these were taken with my digital camera, were just magnificent in the fall. In the right-hand side, you'll see a good example of one of the follies that was found at Bagatelle. The next English landscape garden that we'll look at is Parc des Buttes-Chaumont. This was built in 1864. It was the first park in the northern part of France. It was a collaboration between the great Baron Haussmann, who not only created many of the boulevards in France in the latter part of the 19th century, but also created a more systematic idea of the arrondissement system, so that there was a clear definition. The sections of Paris, the arrondissement, were increased from about 8 to 26. His partner in this work, if you will, was Napoleon III, and together they created parks, boulevards, and a more organized system of Paris. Parc des Buttes-Chaumont is a completely manufactured park. Very little of it is natural. Some of the topography was existing, but this lake was created, was man-made. And much of the rockwork, or what looks like rockwork, is actually concrete. That was created, and this was a modern artifice created by the engineer. He also brought some of the elements that we've seen before from other periods in time, other countries. This is a replica of the pan of Sibyl taken from Villa d'Este outside of Rome. While this railing may look like it's tree branches, in fact, it's reinforced concrete. And this magical waterfall with its bridges is both natural stone, but also poured concrete with reinforcement throughout. The next very large park that we'll look at is Bois de Vincennes. Bois de Vincennes was originally the hunting park for the king. It's outside of Paris, southeast corner of Paris, and is almost 2,400 acres, which is 3 times larger than our own Central Park. Bois de Vincennes has many different elements, including the show garden of dahlias. The dahlias are meticulously maintained and show every type of dahlia that one could wish. Every color, shape. And in addition to the dahlia gardens, there are green roof gardens, there are grass gardens, there's also a lake for boats, areas to ride a bicycle. It's an open expanse. It's sometimes called the lungs of Paris. The Musée de Carnavalet is a very small garden, and many garden books of Paris might not include this miniature park. However, I found it just a perfect example of how the Parisians love to put greenery in everything they do, in their museums, to incorporate into their daily life. The Musée du Carnavalet is actually the museum of the city of Paris, located in the Marais district, which is slightly north of the Louvre, north and northwest. This garden is a lovely example of so many different styles. It was created in about the same time as Buttes-Chaumont in the 1860s by Baron Haussmann, who declared that this building would become the Museum of the City of Paris. And the garden itself shows the very strong lines of a carefully clipped box hedge, as well as roses, and then the annuals that are bedded out. And as you walk through the museum, you can look out windows and see certain courtyards. And this is a clever example of the potager, which I mentioned before. This is an herb garden, so stylish with its branch fencing that goes around it, just to give it a formality. It's really not that useful, this very low fence, but it gives it a strong sense of style, of symmetry. It encloses the somewhat wild and woolly herbs. And of course, there's the statue. Statues are everywhere, and this one looks as though it's been taken from another location and placed in the niche of this courtyard. Across the street from the Musée de Carnavalet is a very small square called Jardin de l'Hôtel d'Ornon. I like this garden because it was a green pocket, very small. I would say it's about the size of a tennis court. So a tiny little respite. When I was there was a grandmother, her daughter, and her child playing in the garden, and that was it. It was just me and these three people. If you look, the maintenance is in all stages of growth and maintenance style. If you look against the wall, the top of the slide, you'll see some rather unkempt yew branches that are coming out of a strongly clipped rectangular yew hedge. And I guess the gardener had left his ladder behind that day. But then you see directly in front, you see the pyramidal yews that are very closely clipped. At the base of them, I noticed that there were some new plants that hadn't yet been clipped. They probably had been replaced in the last season. And then geraniums bedded out with some grasses and other plants to give this garden color during the summer months. The Musée de Rodin is one of those beautiful gardens that is also tucked away behind a wall and on a busy street in Paris. This is in the 7th arrondissement, very close to Invalides. It was the studio for the great sculptor Auguste Rodin. He used it in the last 10 years of his life. When he decided to give the building and grounds to the French government, he required that they also show not only his collection, but also the collection of Renoir and Van Gogh. Behind the museum, which houses many of his statues, is a garden in somewhat formal style, a broad expanse of grass. It's similar to what we saw at Versailles, but such a different size, much, much smaller. And throughout the garden are statues by Rodin himself. This is the famous statue, The Thinker, which is in front of a building that borders the street. Behind us is the studio, or the large city house that Rodin lived in. And again, the clipped hedges, which we see very tightly clipped, and in this case, pyramidal hedges. And walking around the statue, one can look up at the glorious blue Paris sky on this day. Another statue has, in the very far background, the Eiffel Tower. So what a view. You've got Rodin's sculpture, the heavily clipped yew pyramidal hedges with the Eiffel Tower in back. And on the left is the Musée de Rodin. This is a wonderful garden to stop in for something to eat, a stroll to sit down, going between, say, for instance, the Luxembourg gardens and the Invalides gardens. What might not be considered actually a garden of Paris is the Mosque de Paris. This is the Islamic Center for Study. It was created in 1922. It has inside a typical Islamic courtyard. It is important to have a courtyard that symbolizes paradise to the Muslims. This is a similar garden in style and feel to Generalife and Alhambra in southern Spain. It has tile everywhere, water flowing. When I visited this garden, there was no water in the channels, and also vertical accents of the cypress trees, and then the very tightly clipped box hedge, which I would say is a bit of a French addition to this mostly Islamic garden. And if you choose, you can go have tea in this very elegant, informal tea garden. Outside, you can have tea and baklava. Inside, there's another restaurant. And if you so desire, there's a hammam, which is a bath, a public bath where you can go, women on certain days and men on others. So this is a garden that is replete with all sorts of delights. The Promenade du Plantee is the first example of an elevated garden. It was created from an abandoned railroad in Paris and stretches almost 2 miles from the Place de Bastille towards the Bois de Vincennes. It has many themed gardens. You see in the upper left a water channel garden, overhead structures such as the trellis, roses, and it also passes through buildings such as this apartment building. The Promenade du Plantee was built between 1889 and 2000, so we've moved along a bit in history, and we're now in the 20th century, and is the example for New York City's High Line, which is shown in the lower right corner. The High Line, which is a highly popular new park in New York City today, was taken in many ways from the example of Promenade du Plantee. As in Paris, the real estate of the area around the High Line has increased dramatically. Actually, a hotel was built above the High Line. That's the building you see in the lower right slide. At the end of Promenade du Plantee is another delightful small garden. It is filled with statues, classical statues. And what I found very interesting was there was a center staircase. It's built on a hill. You can see in the background the apartment buildings, and it's a green space for not only the apartment buildings, but it also serves as a connection between the Promenade du Plantee and Bois de Vincennes. You can walk or take a bike and go the whole length to the Bois de Vincennes. The central staircase is used for those who are able to use the steps, but if you have a bicycle or a baby stroller, or if you just want to leisurely move, you can go from this level, the zigzag path that goes behind the statue down, and then continues along the slope of the park to the street level. So it's a very accessible park for all. Another 20th century, late 20th century garden is the Carousel Garden. This was created by the still living and great Belgian landscape architect Jacques Weerts. What he created was a transitional green area between I.M. Pei's building in the center of the Louvre. The I.M. Pei's building has now become the central entrance for the entire Louvre. You actually go down beneath the glass pyramid. So as a transition between the pyramid and the Tuileries Gardens, created in the 1600s and then redone by André Le Nôtre in the 1700s. So now we have a 20th century garden, the Carousel Garden, which has multiple statues by the famous sculptor Malot. There are statues as well by Rodin in this garden. And it has this wonderful billowing hedge throughout the garden. And if you look, they look almost like rays of sun. They reach out away from the Louvre towards the Tuileries Gardens, towards the rest of France. And one might suggest, I don't know this for a fact, but one might suggest that this is symbolic of Louis XIV, who was considered the Sun King of France. These billowing hedges are specifically pruned so that they bulge out at certain points, and that's a technique that André Wiertz has used. Our final garden is the Musée de Quai Branly. This garden is actually a vertical garden. It was built specifically for the surface of a newly built museum. The exterior was created by a man named Patrick Leblanc. A year ago, there was an exhibit by him of his vertical gardens at the New York Botanical Garden. And he's a world-renowned designer, very interested in biodiversity. The surface of his building comprises of his garden comprises of aluminum scaffolding with felt material that's been placed on the aluminum scaffolding. And then plant material and a planting medium is placed in this felt. On the surface of the building, we see different plant materials, quite a few common to us. Bergenia on the upper left, Epimedium right, Pachysandra lower right, and sedges on your left. I'm going to close with a very small garden, Jardin d'Ajaccio, which is across the street from the Invalides. And this garden, while it has nothing of great renown to it, is a perfect example of what gardens and parks throughout Paris do for their residents. And it has all the elements: the statue, the green lawn area, the canopy of the trees, the pea gravel walks. Makes a restful place to stop during a hectic day, either as a Parisian resident or else as a tourist. And I will leave you with this image, and I thank you very much for joining me with a tour of Paris. Thank you.